Over the last few months, there's obviously been a lot of talk about the debt crisis. Not trusting the TV media, talk radio, and certainly not our politicians, I wanted to know more about this mess. So I went digging for the facts and got an education that I wanted to share with others in pretty simple terms. I wanted to better understand what's driving the debt problem, so I went to the GPO's website to get historical budget data and started analyzing it. I used the last 40 years' data and put together some graphs that show some of the problems. As you can see, the revenue and expenses are showing a very bad trend the past few years. Revenue has declined while expenses have soared. Keep in mind that the government's fiscal years run October 1st through September 30th, so fiscal year 2011 is coming to a close. Also keep in mind that fiscal year 2011 is a budgeted number, not an actual data, since the fiscal year is not yet completed. The most common way of looking at the federal budget is as a percentage of GDP, so let's look at GDP through 2010. 2011 would be a forecast, so I didn't include it here, but as we know from the first 2 quarters of 2011, it's running at about a 1% increase from 2010, which is obviously very slow growth. For the first time in 40 years, the economy of the United States, measured by GDP, actually declined in 2009. Let's look at the growth rates of GDP over the last 40 years. In the top graph here, you can see that GDP has always increased by at least 3%, often much higher, until 2009 when it actually decreased by 2.1%. In the bottom graph, I looked at a 10-year trailing average. This shows that up until 2009, on a trailing decade basis, GDP growth is steadily declining, but has still been increasing 5 to 6% for quite some time. Now, at a macro level, this probably points to a different issue about the peaking of a phenomenal growth period and the fact that we simply can't maintain 6% growth rates forever. But I'm not getting into that today, quite frankly, because I don't know enough about it. Next, let's dive into the income of the United States, tax revenues. Measured as a percentage of GDP, you can see that tax revenues average somewhere in the range of 18% of GDP. As GDP has grown over the years, typically so has the total tax revenue. It's been over 20% of GDP only once in 2000 and under 17% only twice in 2003 and 2004. That is, until the last 2 years when it's been below 15%. Just for perspective, 2% of today's GDP, which is around $14 trillion, amounts to about $300 billion, which, by the way, amounts to about 1/5 of the 2011 deficit. So, in other words, if spending stays the same and GDP stays the same, we'll need tax revenues up around 26% of GDP to balance the budget. Anyway, generally speaking, about 18% of GDP goes to the federal government as tax revenues every year. So, why has it been so low the last 2 years? Well, I don't know for sure, but I wanted to know more, so I dug into the details a little. First of all, what makes up tax revenue? The biggest chunk is personal income taxes, then Social Security and payroll taxes. I was actually surprised to learn that corporate income taxes only make up about 11% of the total. So, what have each of these buckets done relative to their historic averages lately? These 4 graphs show each of the 4 big buckets of tax revenue. The graphs are on the same scale, 0 to 12%, to keep them relative to each other. Now, for the historic averages, which are shown with the hashed lines, I excluded the last 2 years, so it's an average from 1971 through 2008, a 38-year period. You can see that all 4 buckets are currently below their historical averages with respect to the percentage of GDP that they represent. Obviously, personal income taxes represent the biggest drop, both in terms of percentage below average, as well as in real dollars. Why is that? I'm not sure, but for those who believe it's due to the Bush tax cuts in 2001 and 2003, how do you explain 2006 through 2008 when it was right around the historical averages? There's clearly more to these percentages than just the tax rates of individuals and corporations. More on solutions later, so let's move on. Spending. Let's look at the federal government's expenses, also as a percentage of GDP. Over the last 40 years, it moved around a lot, but in general, it averages around 20% of GDP. As you can see, the last 2 years, it has spiked significantly. As we did with tax revenues, let's dig into this. What makes up government spending? There are many ways to slice it and report it, but the most popular way is to slice it as mandatory and discretionary spending, and of course the interest expenses on debt, which is currently running about 6% of total spending. So, what's caused overall spending to spike the last 2 years as a percentage of GDP? Let's look at these 3 buckets. Again, the scale for each of these graphs is the same, 0 to 16%, so that expenses are relative to each other. As you can see, mandatory spending has spiked well above its historical average of around 10% of GDP. Discretionary spending is up from its historical average of about 8% of GDP. And interest expenses have actually gone down as a percentage of GDP. This is primarily driven by interest rates on government debt dropping over the last few years. So let's drill into mandatory spending. Mandatory spending is made up of several big buckets, the biggest being Social Security. The top 4 buckets here make up about 96% of mandatory spending, so let's drill into those further to see if we can tell why mandatory spending has spiked so much. As you can see, all 4 have increased well above their historical averages, so this looks to be across the board. This so-called mandatory spending is increasingly out of control. It's not just one bucket here. Discretionary spending is made up of a lot of departments within the federal government, but the biggest is obviously the Department of Defense, which is more than half of the discretionary spending bucket. As expected, the defense spending is up relative to its historical year average. Note that it's still below where it was through most of the 70s and 80s relative to GDP. So, let's reset for a minute. I started by saying that I wanted the facts, and I wanted to better understand what's driving the debt problem. The first problem is GDP. It was negative for the first time in 2009 and is still relatively stagnant. We've seen large, steady growth for most of the last 40 years, but the economy is just not growing over the last few years, at least not the way we're used to. The second problem is tax revenues. Our tax revenue as a percentage of GDP is lower than it's ever been, or at least in the 40 years that I analyzed it. Again, I don't know exactly what drives this, but it needs to be back up in the 18% range. The third problem is spending. Our spending as a percentage of GDP is higher than it's ever been, or at least in the 40 years that I analyzed it. The fourth problem, and probably the biggest problem, is that unbalanced budgets are commonplace, and always have been. Even if you discard the last 2 years where things have gotten really bad, the averages since 1971 are still about 2% apart. Spending has never been below 18% of GDP, which is the average of tax revenues, and tax revenues have only once been above 20% of GDP, which is the average of spending. This is a perpetual problem. It's simply gotten worse the past few years. All of these issues create the debt problem. Actually, it's not as much a debt problem as it is a debt-to-income ratio problem. Debt is not necessarily a bad thing. We all have debt. The problem is when debt becomes too big relative to your income level. That makes you unable to service the debt or pay the interest on it. The debt-to-income ratio speaks to the person's or company's, or in this case the country's, ability to pay back that debt. The debt-to-income ratio of the United States has spiked in the past 3 years to levels previously unseen. This metric is what's driving the credit problems of the country. 2 things drive the debt-to-income ratio. Obviously total debt and total income, but more specifically the growth rates of each. If debt grows, but income grows faster, then debt-to-income ratio actually goes down. This is a bit of an eye chart, but the red line here shows the growth rate of U.S. debt. It's grown every year in the last 40 years. The green line shows the growth rate of U.S. income, or tax revenue. It obviously jumps around a lot, and it hit an all-time low in 2009 with about a 16% decrease from the previous year. Again, growing debt isn't necessarily a problem in and of itself. Notice that from 1994 to 2000, the debt, the red line, was still growing. It's above 0% for all of these years. But income growth, the green line, is actually higher, meaning income was growing even faster than debt was growing. So the debt-to-income ratio actually went down during those years from 3.8 to 2.8, which was a really good thing. Let's look at the trends of these two lines. This is another eye chart, so sorry about that. The dotted red line shows the last 40 years average of debt growth. It shows that the debt increases on average almost 9.5% every year. The dotted green line shows the last 40 years average of income growth. It shows that income increases on average about 6.5% every year. Not good when debt increases almost 50% faster than income. The solid lines show a 10-year trailing average, so debt growth, the red solid line, has actually slowed over the last 15 years or so, but so has the income growth. Whenever the red line is above the green line, the debt-to-income ratio is going up. Not too many periods lately where debt-to-income is going down. Of course, the last few years show a terrible trend in both. These lines show a 10-year trailing number, but if you look at just the last 3 years, debt has been growing about 15% annually, while income has actually been decreasing about 5.5% annually. Yes, that's over a 20% difference, which drives the huge increase in debt-to-income ratio lately. So, where does this leave us? Let's go back to the debt-to-income ratio slide. The top graph here is the same debt-to-income graph I showed a few slides back. It shows that debt-to-income ratio has skyrocketed in the past few years from around 4 in 2008 to over 7 in 2011. The bottom graph shows real U.S. debt and real U.S. income, but they are positioned on different axes to show them relative to each other. The red line shows U.S. debt measured on the left axis. At the end of fiscal year 2011, which is still a forecast at this point, it will be somewhere north of $15 trillion. The green line shows U.S. income measured on the right axis. The fiscal year 2011 forecast is about $2.2 trillion, which is pretty flat from 2010 and 2009, and actually down from the previous years. It's actually about the same as fiscal year 2005, yet debt has grown 96% since 2005. Yes, debt has almost doubled in 6 years, which is about 12% growth per year, while income has remained completely flat. During that time period, since 2005, the debt-to-income ratio has gone from 3.7 to 7.1. So, the debt problem, or really the credit problem of the United States, really boils down to getting the debt-to-income ratio under control. Lenders don't want to lend money to an entity, in this case the United States, if that entity doesn't have the ability to pay back that debt. And the debt-to-income ratio is the primary indicator of an entity's ability to pay back a loan. In order to get the debt-to-income ratio back down below 4, which is actually still probably too high, one of a couple things has to happen. Excuse me. Well, technically, one thing has to happen, which is that income has to grow faster than our debt grows. And if it's going to get back down below 4 in the foreseeable future, then something has to happen fast. So, here are a couple scenarios to kick around to achieve a debt-to-income ratio of 4. Let's say debt doesn't increase one bit from the current level of about $14.5 trillion. Income would need to be at $3.6 trillion per year. That's about a 67% increase in income from the current levels of $2.1 trillion per year. We would have to grow income at more than 10.8% per year for 5 straight years. And that's if we had a fully balanced budget right now and incurred no more debt starting today. As we saw earlier, revenues over the last 20 years or so have averaged about 5 to 6% annual increases. So 10.8% annual growth in income seems a bit of a stretch. Here's another scenario. Let's assume income grows at 8% per year for the next 5 years. it would be about $3.2 trillion annually, which means debt would have to be reduced down to $12.8 trillion, which is about a $2.3 trillion, which is about $2.3 trillion less than where it will be at the end of fiscal year 2011. That would take a better than balanced budget by about $545 billion, half a trillion dollars, for 5 straight years. Not going to happen. Given that debt continues to go up and we don't have a balanced budget, let's see what the future looks like. Most forecasts have debt reaching at least $20 trillion within the next 4 to 5 years. Let's say that tax revenues starting in fiscal year 2012, which is October 1st, start growing at 5.5% annually again and maintain that level for the next 5 years. Unlikely, but let's assume it for now. And let's say that our federal spending slows down from the current growth rates down to only 2% growth per year from fiscal year 2012 through fiscal year 2016. This is what it looks like. The debt level in 2016 would be almost $23 trillion, and the annual tax revenues would be around $2.8 trillion, creating a debt-to-income ratio of more than 8. The good news in this scenario is that the debt growth is slowing from 14% annually to 6% annually. So the debt-to-income ratio, while still going up, it's actually growing at a slower rate each year. And that scenario is based on some pretty unrealistic assumptions given the current trends today. The best case scenario is that we have significant changes to the budget and balance it in fiscal year 2013. By then, debt will be around $17 trillion or so, which means we need to get annual income up to $4.3 trillion. Say we have some changes in economic policy that stimulate growth, and we see 6% annual increases in GDP, and we also get tax revenues as a percentage of GDP back up to 18%, starting in fiscal year 2013. Again, a balanced budget would mean that expenses would be down at 18% of GDP as well, and debt would flatline at around $17 trillion. Under that scenario, we'd get the debt-to-income ratio back down to 4 in 2020. Lots of drastic things have to happen, and those changes need to happen quickly. So that's the bottom line. Our debt-to-income ratio is way out of control and growing higher by the day. To me, quite frankly, it's shocking that it's taken 2+ years of debt-to-income ratios skyrocketing to have our credit rating downgraded, given the current trends and the lack of any real solutions or even progress. We are very far from a balanced budget. We're continuing to rack up debt at unprecedented levels, and we have no real economic policy that will trigger high levels of growth in the United States GDP. The recent congressional deal to increase the debt limit supposedly had massive cuts to spending, but what wasn't advertised by Congress and the media was that it doesn't really cut $2.5 trillion off of the debt level in the next decade. It actually reduces the cumulative annual deficit over the next 10 years from about $10 trillion to about $7.5 trillion. That means that long-term budgeting would put the deficit at around $22 trillion in 2021. Some kind of spending cuts, huh? So, let's talk about solutions for a minute. Where do we focus? The two political parties want to focus on different things and blame the other side for not being able to fix it. So which is really the bigger problem? Revenues being down or spending going up? Let's look at some numbers instead of graphs for a second. These numbers are from 2010. Number 1 shows that the 2010 deficit measured as a percentage of GDP was 8.91% of GDP. What makes up this 8.9%? Number 2 shows that tax revenues were 14.9% of GDP, which is 3.27% less than the historical averages, which were 18.2%. So basically 3.27% of the 8.91% is from tax revenues being below their historical averages. Number 3 shows that spending was 23.8%, of GDP, which is 3.5% more than historical averages of 20.3%. Again, I'm using 1971 to 2008 as what I'm calling the historical averages. So the problem is pretty nearly equal in those terms. Spending is slightly farther from the historical average than tax revenue is, but not by much. And of course, the historical average is to run deficits of about 2.14% of GDP. So it's not just a spending problem, as Republicans will have you believe, but it's also not just a problem that increased tax revenues are going to solve either. A complete change in our entire budgeting process is necessary to have a chance of solving these problems. I guess the bigger question is what's actually driving the budgeting process in Washington, D.C.? Revenues or spending? I learned a long time ago in my business career that you can't run expenses at levels where you think revenues should be or will be at some point in the future. Revenues should dictate expenses in the budgeting process. Those individuals that spend money based on the potential of their future income better be careful, or else you can get yourself into a lot of trouble really fast, right? If your income ever decreases, or even stays the same when you expected it to go up, credit problems are going to slap you in the face pretty quickly. Somebody raise your hand if you've run into this problem before. To me, budgeting is about three key processes: maximizing your income, forecasting that income, and then prioritizing your expenses. And the more accurately you can forecast your income year to year, the easier it is to plan your expenses in the future. Let's talk about maximizing income for the United States. How do we increase overall tax revenue? Obviously, there are two levers we can pull: increasing GDP or increasing tax revenue as a percentage of GDP, or preferably both. I don't claim to be an expert here at all, but I do know one thing. Simply increasing tax rates will not necessarily increase overall tax revenue. There are way too many factors involved to make that assumption. The Democrats' philosophy is that we need to raise taxes, either indirectly or directly, on the rich individuals and corporations to drive up tax revenues and close the gap. The Republicans counter this argument by saying that increasing tax rates will stymie GDP growth and thus lower the overall tax revenues coming in. They claim that lower tax rates will stimulate the economy, grow GDP, and lead to higher overall tax revenues. The idea that 8% of a lot is better than 10% of a little. Conceptually, I think there's something to that, but I'd like to see evidence from history that proves this philosophy. That is, I'd like to see evidence that lowering tax rates will stimulate the economy enough to make up for the lower rates. Certainly someone can show that if it's true, right? With respect to corporate income tax rates, we saw earlier that corporate income taxes only make up about 11% of total tax revenues. In 2010, it was actually just under 9% of total tax revenues, as shown here, and was 1.32% of GDP. Again, I'm no expert on this subject, but math tells me that if we reduced corporate income tax rates, say by 20%, it would boost the economy and grow GDP at a pretty good clip. So what would that look like? Roughly speaking, decreasing corporate tax rates would reduce corporate income tax revenues down from 1.32% to 1.06% of GDP. That's just a calculation on the 20% decrease. That's highlighted here in the yellow cells. And say GDP grows by 2% because of this reduction in corporate tax rates. The other sources of tax revenue, that is, personal income taxes and Social Security, etc., they would all increase by 2%, right, assuming the rates stayed the same on those. So that alone would actually increase total tax revenues. Now, I've made an assumption here that slashing corporate income tax rates by 20% would in and of itself increase GDP by 2%. And I've also made the assumption that the other buckets of revenue would keep the same percentage of GDP. I don't know if those are fair assumptions, but I'd like to see someone smarter than me dig into it and show a fact-based prediction of the impact of reducing corporate income tax rates. The second part of budgeting is forecasting your income. For me, forecasting income is about understanding the past and understanding the impact of changes that may affect the future. Looking at the past 40 years of tax revenue, it's obvious that we're not going to see $3.5 to $4 trillion in tax revenue in the next few years unless something drastic happens. And someone please tell me what changes have been made or are being made that would give you confidence in anything near $3.5 trillion in tax revenue for the next few years. In this graph, the solid lines show actual tax revenue and expenses through 2011. Technically, the 2011 is still a forecast at this point. The dotted lines show the next 5 years. There's an assumption of 12% annual growth in tax revenue for the next 5 years and an assumption of expenses flatlining at the 2011 levels. Neither of these assumptions are remotely likely to happen, and yet we can't convince Congress to actually cut expenses from the current levels down to levels near our forecasted income levels. So what really should the forecast be for tax revenue? Well, GDP is pretty predictable. Yes, GDP dropped significantly in 2009, but in 2010 it grew at almost 3%. We know this year's growth rate is low again, so let's just assume 2 to 3% growth the next few years. Predicting the tax revenue as a percentage of GDP is a little tougher. Why has it dropped below 15%? Why did it drop to 16% and then go back up to over 18% during Bush's 8-year term? Why did it climb steadily to over 20% during Clinton's term? I don't know, but I do know that with the current tax code, no army of people could possibly begin to accurately tell you the exact drivers of this percentage. I don't believe anyone can accurately predict how tax policy will affect this percentage. I'm no expert on the fair tax, but conceptually I buy it, and I have to assume we could more accurately predict this percentage with a more simple tax code. Okay, that's my plug for tax reform. Anyway, given the last 2 years, let's just assume it comes up a little to 16 or 17% for the next few years. So, since fiscal year 2012 starts in a few months, let's apply this logic and forecast income for 2012. Since GDP is based on the calendar year, not the fiscal year, they don't align exactly, but we'll play it out anyway. Close enough for government work. GDP grows about 2.5% from 2010's level of $14.5 trillion to almost $14.9 trillion in 2011, and then another 2.5% to $15.25 trillion in 2012. We said 16 to 17% of GDP for tax revenue, so let's use 16.5%. 16.5% of $15.25 trillion is just over $2.5 trillion. Great. Now we know what's coming in the door. So we know what our budget should be, right? Well, that's not the way it works in D.C. In the real world, we would take our $2.5 trillion in income and figure out where to spend it. It would make for some tough decisions, but we'd prioritize our expenses and figure out where to cut. And for those who say we should borrow in the short term until the economy bounces back, okay, let's play that out. How much can we borrow and still lower the debt-to-income ratio? So our debt should increase at a rate slower than our income is increasing, right? We're using 2.5% as a forecast for the income growth. So let's say we increase debt by 2%, which would still lower the debt-to-income ratio. As we all know, debt just passed the previous limit of $14.3 trillion. A 2% increase would be about $290 billion. Since we actually will have about $225 billion in interest income coming in, and we can add to that number the $290 billion number, let's say we can actually borrow about $515 billion and still bring down our debt-to-income ratio. Okay, so that means we could spend about $3 trillion in fiscal year 2012. Anything more than that, and we'll continue to increase our debt-to-income ratio and dig ourselves an even bigger hole. Even with the latest deal on August the 2nd to supposedly decrease spending, the fiscal year 2012 spending is slated for around $3.7 or $3.8 trillion. Any wonder why our credit has been downgraded? So, what can we do? Let's push our elected officials for solutions. Not just to cut spending and not necessarily to balance the budget, although that would be great. but specifically to reduce the debt-to-income ratio of the U.S. federal government. With the direction of our debt problem, the federal government will either default on its debt or, possibly worse, continue printing money to pay our expenses, which will totally devalue the U.S. dollar. To get things going in the right direction, debt must increase at a slower pace than the increase to income. For those that respond by saying we're going to increase taxes, ask them to prove that it will actually increase overall tax revenue. And for those that respond by saying that we're going to slash spending, ask them to prove that with their spending cuts, debt will grow slower than income is growing. How will they increase the overall tax revenue? What are they doing to grow GDP? These are all problems that we need solutions to. Let's push our Congress to actually deliver results on the debt-to-income ratio so that our financial future is preserved for our children and grandchildren. Let's force a more simple conversation about this topic so that we can all understand it. Let's ask our elected officials and the candidates for the next election to publish online their comprehensive plans outlining forecasts of these numbers, that is, income, expenses, debt, and ultimately the debt-to-income ratio, and have them detail their assumptions for their forecasts. Wouldn't that be very interesting to see?